Lyncher ran frantically through the dimly lit corridors, her mind consumed by the haunting realization that she had always known this moment would arrive. From the instant she had witnessed the downfall of her world, the collapse of everything she had once held dear, a cold certainty had settled in her heart. The once grand Raniero estate, which had stood tall with pride, had been reduced to ruins. The castle gates, once symbols of strength and power, had been shattered beyond repair, and the walls that had once shielded them from the outside world had been ruthlessly torn apart by merciless invaders. Her father and brother had already been slain, their lifeless bodies left behind in the wake of destruction. The loyal servants who had once bustled through the castle halls had met a similar fate. Though they had not carried the Raniero name by blood, they had been bound to the family by loyalty and duty. Yet, none had been spared. The once thriving household had been reduced to nothing more than ashes and corpses. Now, she alone remained, the last direct descendant of the Raniero family. Tears streaked her cheeks as she ran, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The weight of her fate pressed heavily upon her, yet deep inside, she had always known that this day would come. Not long before this devastation, the heir of the Wolf clan, Arsène Eckhart, had taken his final breath. His body had always been weak, his existence plagued by a frailty that had confined him to his bed for most of his short life. His death had been expected, accepted even. However, what had not been expected was the revelation that his passing had not been the result of his illness. Instead, it had been brought about by a calculated scheme. And the one responsible had been none other than her father, the head of the Eagle family. Before Arsène's death, a marriage proposal had been sent by the Wolf clan to the Raniero family. A request had been made for a bride to be sent, a daughter who possessed the rare healing abilities unique to their lineage. It had been believed that her powers could grant Arsène a chance at survival. In exchange, an overwhelming amount of wealth and resources had been offered as compensation. With such an advantageous proposal laid before them, the Raniero family had found no reason to refuse. Her father had pledged to send a direct descendant, and he had remained true to his word. However, the one chosen had not been Lyncher, nor had it been any other child possessing the healing abilities of their bloodline. Instead, the one sent had been her half-sister, Shovel, the sole mutant of the three clans. Unlike the others, who had been blessed with the power to heal, Shovel had been born with an ability that could not have been further from that of a savior. Rather than bestowing life, she had possessed the power to steal it. With cold calculation, her father had sent Shovel to Arsène under the guise of a devoted bride, all the while intending for her to drain his life force until nothing remained. The heir of the Wolf clan had perished soon after, his life stolen by the very person meant to save him. Yet, what her father had failed to anticipate had been the storm of fury that would follow. The wolves, stripped of their heir, had lost all sense of reason. Their grief had turned into unrelenting rage, their only desire being to seek vengeance against those who had orchestrated the death of their future leader. No plea had been heard, no explanation had been accepted. Their wrath had descended upon the Raniero estate like a tempest, swift and merciless. As Lyncher had glanced out the window, her heart had pounded violently in her chest. The flicker of movement outside had caught her eye, and in that instant, she had realized that she had been seen. Panic had surged through her veins as she had turned on her heels, sprinting down the corridor. Desperate thoughts had raced through her mind, trying to convince herself that it had been impossible for them to have spotted her. After all, her room had been hidden away in the most remote section of the estate, an area so secluded that even the maids had struggled to find their way. Her existence had been an embarrassment to the Raniero family. With hair the color of deep crimson, an unnatural shade within their bloodline, she had been regarded as a disgrace, a mistake unworthy of acknowledgement. Because of this, she had been cast away, treated as if she did not exist. Yet, despite being locked away, she had always dreamed of freedom. The vast, open sky had called to her, whispering promises of a world far beyond the cold walls of her prison. The air around her had suddenly become thick, her breaths becoming strained. A violent cough had erupted from her throat, causing her body to tremble with each painful gasp. Confusion had clouded her mind as she had struggled to understand the cause of her suffocation. Then, she had seen it. Dark smoke had curled into her room, creeping in through the cracks like a silent predator. A fire had been set, and it had already begun consuming everything in its path. Her lungs had burned with every breath, her vision stinging as the acrid scent filled her nose. Her human form had begun to weaken, the unbearable heat causing her wings to stir beneath her skin. Yet, despite her bloodline's famed healing abilities, no power could have saved her from this fate. Healing had never been meant for themselves. The flames had continued to spread, devouring the estate she had called home. Her legs had felt too weak to move, her body refusing to obey. A terrifying realization had settled upon her: escape had been impossible. Her eyes had fluttered shut, her final thoughts drifting toward the cruel twist of fate that had led her to this moment. At the tender age of 12, she had met the same end as the Wolf clan heir who had died only a week before. Morning had arrived, yet the world had felt entirely different. A distant voice had called out, urging her to awaken. The sound had been familiar, yet impossibly so. Linsher's eyes had opened slowly, confusion clouding her mind. Before her, a figure had stood, watching her with impatient concern. Adele. Shock had paralyzed her. This could not have been real. Adele had died 2 years ago, her life taken unjustly under false accusations of betrayal. As Linsher's personal maid, she had been framed for leaking the secrets of the Raniero family. The punishment had been swift: execution. Yet, despite that undeniable truth, Adele had been standing before her, just as she had in the past. The blanket had been pulled away, and words had been spoken with a tone of urgency. Linsher had been told that she usually awoke with ease and that if they had not hurried, they would have been late for lunch. The words had barely registered. A dull ringing had filled her ears as she had sat motionless, her mind attempting to grasp the impossible. What had been happening? Where had she been? And why had she awakened to a world that should no longer have existed? The name escaped her lips in a whisper, filled with disbelief: Adele. The woman, looking slightly confused yet composed, responded with a gentle nod before reminding Linsher that an appointment with the master had been scheduled for that day. It was urged that she should quickly compose herself and prepare. However, just as those words were spoken, Adele's expression shifted as she noticed the silent tears cascading down Linsher's cheeks. A deep concern filled her gaze as she stepped closer, taking Linsher's trembling hands in her own. A question was then asked: whether a nightmare had disturbed Linsher's sleep. The moment those words reached her ears, Linsher's fragile composure shattered completely. A strangled sob escaped her lips before she lunged forward, wrapping her arms tightly around Adele. The warmth of her presence, so familiar yet so distant, made the floodgates of emotions burst open. Between choked breaths, she clung to Adele, whispering over and over how much she had been missed. Her mind, still hazy and overwhelmed, struggled to grasp the reality of what was happening. An echoing thought ran through her: if this was truly the afterlife, then she was grateful to have been given the chance to meet Adele again. That fragile moment of reunion, however, was shattered by the sudden sound of an authoritative voice cutting through the air. A question, laced with impatience, was posed: what was happening? Linsher's breath hitched as she turned toward the source of the voice, and to her utter astonishment, the familiar figure of Lady Kellen stood before her. The unwavering posture, the strict gaze, and the coldly refined demeanor, it was undeniably her. With an air of disapproval, it was stated that the commotion had been loud enough to be heard from down the hall, and Linsher was ordered to compose herself immediately. Adele, bowing slightly, responded with an apology, explaining that Linsher had likely experienced a nightmare. However, Lady Kellen remained unaffected by this reasoning, instead reminding them of the luncheon scheduled with the master. A quiet realization settled within her: this was not a dream. Adele then urged Linsher to hurry and prepare before a harsher reprimand was received from Lady Kellen. Yet, even as the words were spoken, Linsher hesitated, her mind swirling with confusion and disbelief. It had been years since she had last been invited to one. The memory of her childhood surfaced: at the age of 10, those invitations had ceased. A sudden impulse took over her thoughts, and she asked to be let down. Moving towards the mirror, she hesitated for only a brief moment before posing an uncertain question to Adele, her own age. Adele, with a soft smile, responded with certainty. Since it was her birthday, she had just turned 7 years old. The weight of those words struck Linsher like a thunderclap. Her body tensed as an overwhelming realization washed over her. Could it be possible? Had she truly returned to a time before her death? A short while later, the household had gathered at the long dining table for the scheduled luncheon. Lincher, now seated among them, found herself struggling to suppress the disorientation that continued to weigh upon her. The setting before her was both painfully familiar and completely foreign all at once. Every movement, every hushed breath, and every subtle glance felt like a memory replaying itself before her eyes. As her gaze swept across the table, it eventually landed on the meal set before her. An unbearable sense of suffocation settled in her chest. The reality of her situation was undeniable now, she had returned to the past. Despite the storm of emotions raging within her, she reminded herself that composure was crucial. Her father sat at the head of the table, and under his watchful gaze, table manners had to be upheld without question. A moment later, her father set his spoon down, and with a commanding tone, a reprimand was issued. Shivel, the youngest among them, was told to mind her manners. The child, small and innocent, trembled under the weight of her father's words before meekly responding with a promise to be more careful. As Lincher watched the exchange unfold, an unshakable thought surfaced: Shivel had not yet left. Shivel Rhaenyra, the one who would one day gain the ability to drain the life force of others. The very girl who would, in the future, be responsible for the death of the heir of Eckhart. And yet, at this moment, she was nothing more than the youngest daughter of the Rhaenyra family, unaware of the dark fate that lay ahead of her. Lincher's gaze then shifted towards her father. It was noted that he had remained unchanged, his rigid adherence to etiquette as firm as ever. As a direct descendant of the noble bird clan, he had been raised under the strict discipline of Lady Kellen from a young age. The principles of table manners had been ingrained into him with near military precision. Memories from her past life resurfaced, scenes of herself being scolded just as Shivel had been now. She had been no different. A moment later, her father's gaze landed on her, and an unexpected observation was made. It was noted that her table manners had been particularly graceful that day. The word sent a shock through her system, and before she could stop herself, a fit of coughing overtook her. The sound of laughter rang out from those seated at the table, yet Lincher barely registered it. Her focus remained on her father. Had that truly been allowed to pass without further reprimand? It was nearly impossible to believe. Until just yesterday, at least in her past life, her father had treated her as if she did not exist. Her thoughts spiraled further. The moment his attitude had shifted was one she remembered clearly. It had happened when she had begun to shed her fur, revealing the red hair beneath it. Red fur and feathers, the cursed symbol among all beasts. From that moment forward, she had been locked away in her room, ignored by servants, and left to call out for help that never came. A realization struck her with the weight of an iron chain. Once her molting began again in this life, she would be abandoned once more. Just as before, she would be erased from the Rhaenyra family. A final thought surfaced: would she be forced to die as she had before? The notion was quickly rejected. No, she would not allow that fate to repeat itself. This time, things would be different. As the meal neared its end, her father spoke once more. A piece of information was shared: the head of the Wolf clan would soon be arriving at Rhaenyra. Lincher was instructed to remain in her room the following day, as it was deemed best that she did not encounter him. Hearing this, her mind raced. Had the head of the Wolf clan truly visited at this time in her past life? With an innocent expression, a question was posed to her father: the reason for the visit. A vague response was given: it was uncertain, but something of importance was to be relayed. At that moment, Lincher realized that her father was still unaware. The truth had not yet been revealed: Kendrick Eckhart had come to propose a political marriage with the Bird clan. A single thought took root within her mind. Perhaps, through this marriage, an escape from Rhaenyra was possible. And for the first time, hope flickered within her chest. The silence in Lincher's room was accompanied only by the soft flickering of candlelight. She sat motionless, deep in thought. The absence of the head of the Wolf clan from the Rhaenyra estate had been noted, and from this, a conclusion had been drawn: her father remained unaware of the Wolf clan's true intentions. If that were the case, then the plan they harbored must still be in motion, unchallenged and unseen by those in power. The timing of her intervention needed to be perfect. Any premature action would risk exposure, while hesitation could result in the inevitable unfolding of events she desperately wished to change. With a deep breath, she attempted to reorganize her thoughts, yet her mind remained clouded with uncertainty. Whether this confusion stemmed from the side effects of her regression or the limitations of her younger body, she could not determine. The sharpness of her mind in her previous life had become a distant memory, now replaced with a frustrating haze. Still, certain events remained vividly clear. She recalled how, in her past life, the head of the Eckhart family had arrived at the estate, his purpose unmistakable. A marriage proposal had been presented, and shortly thereafter, Chauvel had been sent to the Duke's residence. The duration of a single month had been all it had taken for that decision to be carried out. The thought of her father's role in those events left an unsettling weight in her chest. The plan to eliminate arson had not been a sudden decision, it had been meticulously crafted over time. As a mutant, Chauvel had possessed a rare ability, to drain life itself. That power must have surfaced early, making him a convenient tool for her father's ambitions. For a brief moment, an alternative plan had been considered, perhaps Chauvel could simply be told to refuse the marriage. But such a simple solution would never work. Her father's determination would not have wavered, regardless of Chauvel's involvement. Something of great value had been received in return for the agreement, something her father would not have been willing to forego. It was the Hampton River. Though modest in size, its significance could not be understated. Its position between the Bird clan and the Wolf clan had made it a constant source of contention. While its waters were not as vast as the larger rivers, the surrounding land was fertile, providing abundant food and numerous strategic advantages. Both clans had long fought over its ownership, and an opportunity to claim it outright would not have been refused by the Bird clan. Meanwhile, the Wolf clan, desperate to protect arson, had no choice but to accept the terms set before them. Her gaze hardened with determination. If the course of fate could not be altered completely, then a single key element would need to be changed. Instead of Chauvel, she herself would take Arson's hand in marriage. If she were the one to heal him, the honor of the Wolf clan would remain intact. There was more to be gained from this arrangement. A request could be made, one that would secure her safety until adulthood. Even after her transformation at the age of 10, when her cursed feathers would replace the fur of her clan, the Wolf clan would have no choice but to keep her by their side. As long as Arson's condition required her healing abilities, she could not be cast aside. Her fingers curled into a determined fist. Confidence filled her. The illness that had plagued Arson could be cured by her alone. Among her family, her power was the strongest, there was no doubt in her mind. A future in which she remained locked away, abandoned and unwanted, would not be accepted. Protection should have been demanded while she still carried the status of a direct descendant from the third marriage. That mistake would not be repeated. The opportunity would arrive the next day. The head of the Wolf clan would visit the Raniero estate in person, and when that moment came, hesitation would not be allowed. The following morning, Adele entered the room, her expression strict. A warning had been issued, leaving the room would not be permitted under any circumstances. A casual request had been made by Lyncher, asking for a short walk, but the request had been refused without hesitation. An excuse had been given, claiming that fresh air was needed, but Adele had remained unmoved. A quick assessment had been made, Adele's resolve was firm, and persuasion through reason would not be possible. A secondary plan would need to be enacted. A sudden gasp had been let out as Lyncher clutched her stomach, an expression of discomfort crossing her face. A complaint had been voiced about hunger. Suspicion had been evident in Adele's eyes. A pointed remark had been made, reminding Lyncher that only moments earlier, an attempt had been made to leave for the garden. Tears had welled up in Lyncher's eyes as a sudden shift had been made, insistence had been expressed that hunger had come suddenly and could no longer be ignored. The claim had not been entirely untrue. Lady Kellen's neglect had often left her without food, a fact that had been well known to Lyncher. And if there was one weakness Adele possessed, it was the sight of Lyncher in distress. A request had been made for permission to visit the kitchen briefly, a question posed as to whether such a thing was truly too much to ask. Hesitation had followed, but in the end, a decision had been made. A compromise had been reached, Adele would retrieve food while Lyncher remained inside. A quick agreement had been given by Lyncher. A final warning had been issued before Adele departed, her return would be swift, and Lyncher was to remain inside the room without attempting to leave. The instant the door had closed, Lyncher's mind had begun racing. The attempt to leave through the front door had failed, but that did not mean all options had been exhausted. Another method existed. Climbing onto her bed, a hand had reached beneath her pillow, retrieving a small slip of paper. This had been her contingency plan, shape-shifting. The limitations of shape-shifting had been acknowledged. Communication would become impossible except among those of the same clan. A precaution had been taken in case verbal exchanges could not occur. A message had been pre-written on the slip of paper. My name is Linsher Raniero. Please take me to Eckhart. With careful steps, the window had been approached. A glance had been cast downward. The head of the wolf clan had not yet departed. Urgency had gripped her. Time was short, Adele's return was inevitable. Typically, the ability to shapeshift was not acquired until after the age of 10. However, the knowledge from her past life had remained. 2 small jumps had been made, just as remembered. The air around her had shifted, the transformation beginning. A silent plea had been made, failure could not be afforded. The transformation, something that had always been deemed uncertain and dangerous, had finally been achieved by her.